Will Podmore is the author of Capability Britain for a Country That Works. This is a pro-Brexit book. We'll talk about it more when we speak to Will. He's also the author of Brexit, the Road to Freedom. Folks, please give a big AFFG welcome to Mr. Will Podmore. Hello, Will. Good evening to you.
Hello, Alistair. Very good to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on. You've been on our show a couple of times before, and it's always a pleasure to have you on the show and to pick your political brains on matters, on current political matters. And your big enthusiasm is Brexit. And are you able, in just a few words, to explain to our viewers why you got so animated with Brexit and why you believe that it was essential and remains essential?
Yes, I mean, it was originally a pro-Britain point of view. I campaigned in 1975 to keep us out of the European Economic Community at that time. And the reason was very largely that I always thought that decisions about what happened in a country should best be made by the people who live in that country rather than by some other people in some other place. And this doesn't just apply to Britain, obviously it applies, I think the French ought to make decisions about what happens in France and the Germans about what happens in Germany. Not that anybody should make decisions about what goes on in another country, because if you allow that to happen, it doesn't usually mean there's any kind of popular control going on. It means that some rather overbearing government is trying to take powers over another country. Now, whether that other country makes its own decisions or not should be up to that country, not to a foreign government, whether it be the Kaiser or Adolf Hitler or the people in Brussels. The same principle should apply, that the people of each country should make the decisions about what happens in that country. They may not make the right decisions, but it's far better that they make their own decisions, even if there are mistakes made, than that somebody else does it for them. And if you're a grown-up, you really should take the responsibility for, what happens to yourself and your country. I think, that we should control it, we should run it. The people of the country should have the dominant say in what happens in that country. Now, the fact, obviously, in Britain over the last few years, it got very messy. As you can see from the number of different prime ministers we've had in the last few years, it's been quite an unprecedentedly chaotic situation, partly because when Theresa May came in, she didn't really believe in Brexit. She campaigned against it, and most of her cabinet did as well, and she just really messed things up considerably. Then along came Boris, who almost fortuitously sort of ended up being for Brexit, but he looked a bit panic-stricken the day that he realised he'd been on the winning side. Do you remember his expression after the, after the night before? He really looked a bit like, oh my God, what have I done?
Yes,
so,
yes.
He didn't have a plan. He didn't have a clue. Cameron didn't. Cameron deliberately didn't create any plans. He didn't have any fallback plan B. He didn't come up with anything positive. He didn't tell the civil service to make any preparation. So naturally enough, everybody was going around the next day saying, what do we do now? And Boris was particularly perturbed, I think. He was very happy because he was in number 10, but he just didn't know what to do with it. I don't think, and I think the next few months just got more and more ropey and chaotic, and we haven't taken advantage of it. We haven't pushed for massive, good new projects. HS2 keeps on getting sabotaged and run down, whatever you think of it. If you're going to have a project, do it. Don't just sort of like say you're going to do it, then dig a few holes and put a few miles of track in, and then sort of say, oh, perhaps we won't do it after all. It's just like half-hearted. In
Yes.
the meantime, the Chinese would have built several different airports and put another 10,000 kilometres of rail track in, whereas we faff about and don't get things done. I'm not saying we should be like China. But a little bit of executive competence would be a very good thing.
Well, 100%, and that's something that we struggle for, at least recently in Britain. We've struggled for leaders with any kind of vision. And especially, and I'm not being party political here, but especially Conservatives seem to lack a lot of vision. I mean, they get in and it's like, well, what are you going to do other than, what's your plan to take forward now? And as you said there about both Cameron and Theresa May, none of them wanted anything to do with this Brexit if they could help it. And they had no plan to take any of that forward. And then Boris kind of ends up, as you put it, just the man who finds himself in that situation, and he's really got no immediate plans on how to capitalize upon it either, unlike for example people like yourself and others who have been thinking about this since, as you say, 1975, and thinking of the possibilities and thinking of the sorts of things that we could be doing instead. What would you, for example, if you were appointed to the cabinet as a non-party member, just as an advisor, what would be one or two of the first things that you would advise the British government to get on right away, as quickly as possible?
Well, this is controversial in certain circles, but I would say develop our energy industries. We've got oil and gas reserves. Well, I think they're quite useful sources of reliable, relatively cheap energy that we don't have to depend on, imports from France or Russia or Saudi Arabia or whatever. If we've got these reserves, these resources, we should put money in. If a private company puts money in, fine. If nobody puts private money in, put public money in. It's so important that we have kind of energy self-reliance.
100%.
Somebody else will choke our energy sources, and it's not good news. So that would be one of the very first things. Another one would be to improve our supply of water, which is not terribly clean in lots of places. We have scandalous situations where sewage is pumped into rivers and onto our beaches. That really ought to be a very top priority to prevent that happening, whatever it takes. Again, the Environment Agency doesn't do very much. The water companies, at one point, Michael Gove pointed out, 95% of the profits water companies made went to the dividends, not into investment, not into improving storm outlets, not into building new pipelines or putting new plastic pipelines inside the old pipelines. It went out of the country usually because 70% of our water companies are owned by foreign owners. So the money didn't even come and stay into our economy. It just went out the door, and that's not terribly good for us, I don't think. So that's important. Transport's another one. We do need to have better links up and down the whole country, up into Scotland and across northern England, probably across Scotland as well. I don't know very much about the Scottish transport network, I'm afraid. But, in England, I had to travel recently from Lancashire to Yorkshire, and it was just appalling. The trains were like out of some kind of, 50s movie, and there was a couple of carriages. It was absolutely rammed full of people. And it ran a few times a day, 2 or 3 times a day or something. How can you generate industrial growth when you can't even communicate across a very important west-east axis? Is there something similar in Scotland? I don't know.
Well, there's there's definitely transport links that can be improved and upgraded in Scotland, but unfortunately, transport is one of these things that's devolved to the incompetent Scottish so-called government. And when you've got the Greens involved in that, they're anti-vehicle and they're anti-transport, and they don't like the idea. I'm being prejudiced against the Greens, I suppose, here, but I think I'm being accurate. They don't want people travelling on roads if they can help it. So there's motorways that need to be upgraded and have needed to be upgraded for 20 years.
Yeah.
And they're not getting upgraded because at the moment the Scottish Greens are putting the kibosh on it. But in England, you're absolutely correct about these huge infrastructure projects, especially improving the links around the north of England and even Scotland into the north of England. These sorts of areas can be improved as well, and that's something that a government should just come in and say, this is what we're going to be doing, and we're spending the money on it. And as you said there, the water and the oil and gas, and you know, again, the whole thing with the oil and gas is that you've got almost all the political parties now who are prejudiced against any kind of carbon development in that way, which well, who knows where all that's going to end, but it's at the moment it's ending in, it's giving us incredibly high prices for our energy resources, and it doesn't look like there's any solution available at the moment. But it's so easy, really, for us to get those solutions. So easy for us to do it if we just simply had the politicians that would grasp the nettle, but they don't, and that's what's the frustrating thing about living in Britain at the present moment, is just the paucity of talent in the political class. Whether that's going to change at the next general election, I don't know, but there's so much that can be done, but nothing is getting done, apart from just, and you have to wonder, that's why some people fall into sort of ideas about, oh, it's all Klaus Schwab's plan and stuff like that. And while I don't want to go down that route, you know, unless the government bucks up and starts improving itself, then everybody's going to be thinking, is there some hidden agenda here? You know, why can't you develop proper energy and water supplies in a first world country?
Yeah, exactly. But you know, the Greens in Scotland have got the SNP by the throat, haven't they, more or less? Because don't the SNP more or less rely on the Greens for their precarious parliamentary majority?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah. And you know, from what I've heard about the Greens, they're not only against oil and gas, they're against nuclear. They want to close that down. It's an awful lot of jobs they're planning to waste, you know, as well as depriving the rest of us of cheap, reliable, secure energy supplies. The Greens are also, as Alistair said, that they're against any form of transport. Air travel, forget it. Ferries, no ferries. Oh, that's all right by the Greens. They're not worried if the SNP can't build the ferries that they promised. That's fine. Who needs ferries?
Yes.
You know, and you know, same with the roads. And also, then the Greens are also, I mean, across the board, they are just a disgrace. I mean, they oppose the monarchy. They try to, you know, insult the coronation. They are very much in favour of this terrible gender recognition reform bill, you know, which is like so anti-women and retrogressive. Actually, it's really very, very bad. And the Green ideology, as such, is not a force for progress. They claim it is, but it isn't. It depends on fantasy about what's going to happen around the corner. You know, it's fantasy that the seas are going to rise, you know, 20 meters, whatever Al Gore told us, you know, in the next few months, you know, whatever, you know, they just exaggerate vastly. You have a 2 or 3 millimeter rise in the sea level, and they just exaggerate. It's rather like Alistair was saying about the marches. You know, you get 3,000 something, and oh, it's 50,000. Well, you know, the sea level, you get 3 millimeters, and the next minute it's 5 meters. You know,
it's almost like for them the truth doesn't matter as long as it serves an agenda to get people moving in a certain direction. They don't care about the actual relevant, the realness of the truth. Talking about Scottish politics, though, you wrote an article which I read here. It was Hot air. Will Podmore takes issue with the empty rhetoric of a case for Scottish independence. And that was published on the 6th of February 2023 in the Morning Star. So that book was Scotland Rising, The Case for Independence by Gerry Hassan. That was your article there, your book review. What can you tell us about this book? What was the point of the book and what was your thoughts on it? Because Gerry Hassan is a well-known Scottish nationalist commentator. He's got a weekly column in The National, and he's like many of these Scottish nationalist commentators. They're able to make a living by writing the same article week on week on week, and the only difference is they put the words in a different order.
Yeah, the same with his books. But my favourite story about Gerry is that in the run-up to the referendum in 2014, he tried to rig a debate on The World Tonight by emailing the programme's producer, asking her to exclude the well-known campaigner for Scottish unity with the rest of the country, Eddie Maguire, who's a good friend of mine, a good comrade, and also a very eminent composer.
Mm.
Now, unfortunately for Gerry, he rather clumsily copied his email to all the people who were invited, including to Eddie.
Fantastic.
Whoops, what an own goal, Mr. Hassan. And, the producer, all credit to her, took no notice of Hassan's somewhat undemocratic request, you might think. Anyway, coming back to his book, Scotland Rising, which is, as Alistair said, it's very much the same as his previous books. He, in this work of fiction or fantasy, to give him credit, he did actually put forward quite a few of the very good arguments for the Union. That there'd be a great financial hit if Scotland lost the benefit of the Barnett formula. There'd be a great risk in setting up a hard border. There'd be a great risk of losing the pound and joining the euro. There'd be a great loss of sovereignty involved in rejoining the EU. There'd be a loss of British identity. There'd be a rupturing of working class solidarity. And then you put all these very good arguments saying, these are all the risks that would happen if we separated off from the rest of Britain. And then there was a kind of big pause. And then he didn't answer any of them. He couldn't come up with any arguments back against all these points. So he really did, score another own goal there. I mean, it's just really very poor. It claims to be a kind of work of the political economy, and in fact, it's not effective at all. It is, as I say, a fantasy, a dream. In it, he does acknowledge again a bit of reality. He says, Scottish public opinion is not at a place where it is decisively in favour of another independence referendum. The belief in Scotland's right to decide its own future has not yet translated into widespread support for a second independence referendum. So he's acknowledging that the majority in Scotland want to stay in Britain, in the United Kingdom. If it was a genuine national liberation struggle, which is what this surgeon used to claim, then there'd be easily 70, 80, 90% support, which is what you tend to get in national liberation movements.
Yes.
In Africa, Asia, Latin America, Ireland, for goodness sake. But there's nothing remotely close to that in Scotland. Even though, again, Ms. Sturgeon always claims there's a majority. But, again, she's just telling porkies it's not the case.
That's right.
Yeah.
Completely. You made the case as well in your book, Your Capability Britain for a Country That Works, which is available from Amazon or good booksellers. That very point about how, for example, the Supreme Court in Canada ruled upon whether Quebec was being oppressed, as it were, and whether they could claim indigenous rights under international law. And you pointed out what the Canadian Supreme Court said, which was basically none of those conditions exist in a first world country. And that sort of human rights legislation is for countries that are visibly under the thumb of an external oppressor. And that was before the Supreme Court in Britain came to exactly the same decision last November, when they also ruled on that very matter, which had been brought before them, that the SNP didn't have a case for sovereign to break away under international law, because you can only do that under international law if you're genuinely oppressed. Although people like Gerry Hassan probably do convince themselves, and I can't speak for him, of course, but he does write sometimes as if he actually does believe that he is genuinely oppressed as a columnist in a national Scottish newspaper. I don't know who he imagines he is on that matter, but
well, even Alex Salmond said once that Scotland is not an oppressed country and has no need to be liberated.
Yes.
I don't know if he realised what he said when he said it, but he wrote it in the introduction to his big screed about how Scotland should be a separate country. But he actually acknowledged that it wasn't a viable proposition at all.
That's right. Yes, you're talking about the white paper, I think, that was released, that courtesy of the British taxpayer who paid for that, and the British civil service, who also was drafted in to write this massive 650-page work, which was irking as well. I just want to end with your words here from Capability Britain, Will. You say that and you're making the case for British independence here, for the British political community of people who identify with Britain. And you say, as an independent country, we can choose democratically how we run our country. When we elect a bunch of rascals, we can later kick them out. We can make our own decisions about policy, about how much the government should intervene in the economy. We can sell goods and services to those who want to buy them anywhere in the world, with no need for permission from politicians or the EU. We can unite our whole country behind a programme for progress. The national government, local authorities, our businesses and services must all plan to make a success of independence. People talk about the government running the country, but most of the time workers run the country. It is workers who run the NHS day in and day out. Workers who keep the power lines humming. Workers who drive the buses, trains, vans and trucks. The crucial challenge facing the working class is how to take control in the interests of the people of Britain. The unavoidable conclusion for workers is that they must wrest control for themselves. Well, that's absolutely the case, and let's hope that enough of us workers can see the plans that you've been putting out for United Britain, and for an industrial, progressive, democratic one as well.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would urge people to get Capability Britain for a Country That Works. This was published in 2021, and your earlier book was published just after Brexit in 2018. Brexit the Road. Brexit the Road to Freedom. Good stuff. Well, it's 5 to 8. The 25 minutes has gone in very quickly. Thank you very much for all your considered comments. You've got a lot to say, and I'm glad to say that you've written it down in your books. And any more books in the can?
Actually, not at the moment.
No.
But more reviews and articles and letters. I write letters to our local paper, the Ilford Recorder, which generously quite often printed, including ones about the necessity for having a united Britain. You know, the absolute folly of splitting our country into pieces. Partition is not good for countries. The SNP's programme is destructive. You know. not to be given any mercy. Really, we really ought to be, when they're down, and I think they are quite down at the moment. It's quite a good time to keep pressing them down.
Yes, that's what I like about your writing as well, is you emphasise something that's not emphasised enough, is about how the working class in Britain need to identify together, because under a separate England and a separate Scotland, you would have all these, you'd have Scottish unions fighting with English unions, Scottish shipyards and so on fighting with the English and so on. At least within a concept of the United Kingdom, you can bring it together as much as is possible within our islands. Well,
particularly the defence industry. It's very important that we have elements of the defence industry, in all parts of our country. Because we need a strong, effective defence industry at the core of our manufacturing industry.
100%, absolutely. Okay, well, thank you very much for all the work that you've done, and thank you for coming on tonight. And we'll definitely have you back on again. And good stuff.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I look forward to that.
Susie says, I'll hunt out those books. They look interesting. And Catherine says, thank you, Will. Great chat. And Christopher says, thank you for all your contributions here, Will. And Stuart says, great stuff. So, good stuff, Will. We'll speak to you again. Have a good night.
Look forward to that. And well done, everybody at Force for Good. You really are a great credit to our whole nation. Thank you so much for all you do, all of you.
Thank you, Will. Good night.
Good night.